Our first conversation, which I'm going to also be part of, is what's new in 2022, hotel rate parity trends across Europe. So a few years ago, I mean, we've been like deep in parity at Triptease for 10 years because it was very clearly the key thing to fix for helping hotels drive direct. And we figured, we really had to put the best and brightest onto this challenge. And so we found Andrew Williamson, who's going to be up in a minute, who was finishing off a PhD in physics. He'd been looking at how to solve the world's energy crisis using photovoltaic cells. And having done that, he was after a tougher challenge. So he came to us to try and help hotels with their parity. And so he's going to talk us through a little bit of the research he's been doing the last few weeks. Andrew. With you. Hello.
Cool, thanks very much for having me. I guess I'll start this. This is actually the first time I've seen this slide.
Oh, I was playing with your slides. I was trying to find something that was meant to be in line and in unison and the same, but wasn't quite. But anyway.
Do I need to be cautious about any other slides?
No, that's the only one.
Okay, fine. Right, well, welcome to the hangover slot. I think most people like to kind of work off a hangover perhaps by going to the gym or Bloody Mary, but actually what you've got is 40 minutes of hardcore data analysis, so I hope you're ready for that. That's how I like to work off my hangovers. Anyway, so here we go. Oh no, there is, I'm just going to skip past these.
Yeah, we're
just going to skip past these. Okay, yeah, so as Charlie said, I used to do physics research. I was in the field of renewable energy. When I was doing my PhD, the way that we used to do our research was all around, we would kind of go away for like 2 weeks to an experimental facility, and we'd maximize our time there to do our experiments by working 24/7. So it involved doing shifts, basically. And as a PhD student, you tend to draw the short straw on that, and you have to work the nights. The way the experiments work, you kind of set them up, and they start going, and then you wait for a few hours, basically, while they collect data. So actually, a lot of what we were occupying ourselves with on these night shifts was kind of keeping ourselves entertained and also feeding ourselves, because, of course, there was no canteen or anywhere to get food at 4 in the morning. So the best way that we could fill our time was actually kind of combining those two concerns of trying not to be bored and trying not to be hungry. And some of those ideas and experiments we had were quite successful. For example, making frozen yogurt with liquid nitrogen that we found around the lab. That one was quite successful. Some of them less successful, like trying to cook pasta in a travel kettle, which I felt like should work in theory, but in practice, you just have to buy your boss a new kettle. That's pretty much how that one panned out.
Yeah.
But actually, there was quite a lot of serious research that was done in these experiments. It wasn't just messing around. And we would come away from these big, long experimental trips with mountains and mountains of data. And I would often spend the next 3 to 6 months sifting through that, trying to work out how to analyze it and what questions to ask. And one of the key things that I learned from doing my data analysis for my PhD was if you don't quite understand what's happening in the data, the thing to do is to ask as many different questions as you can as possible. Often you'll ask, the first question you'll ask will be quite an obvious one, and that will tell you something that's useful, but it will never tell you everything about what's going on. You always have to ask lots of different questions, and some of them will give you slightly different answers, maybe don't quite agree with each other, but overall, you start to build up a bigger picture of what's going on. And the reason I'm telling you about this is because the same is kind of true for parity data, right? There's huge amounts of parity data out there. We've got loads and loads of prices that we've seen across all these different channels for all these different hotels around the world. And trying to make sense of it is really challenging, right? So this is kind of a snapshot of my life over the last few weeks. Pie chart Armageddon. It was quite stressful trying to work out what I wanted to present for this conversation at DBS. But eventually, after asking loads and loads of different questions of the data, I did eventually kind of come out on a few key insights that I want to share with you. And so what I'll do in this presentation is kind of take you on a journey of the kinds of questions that I ask of the data to try and work out what's going on. So to begin with, great question to ask at the start is probably the most obvious one, which is, am I being undercut and how often? And I can do that because we have 10,000 hotels all around the world. I can work out what the average undercut rate is per region over time. So this is what I've plotted over the start of the last year and a half. And broken down by different regions in the world, you can see how the undercut rate has changed. So that's just the percentages of the time where direct was not the cheapest price. where an OTA had a best price.
So we're seeing parity improving over time in EMEA?
Yes, EMEA is in orange there, so
Europe.
that's gone down from 30% at the start of 2021, and we're about 20% now. But you compare that to APAC in purple, for example, and you can see that that's actually kind of a bit more of a roller coaster over that period. It kind of shows that actually parity is not predictable, right? It doesn't follow any kind of logic. All of these changes in pricing they're being made by people or by algorithms. At different organizations, and all of these decisions are intended to, I guess, make most sense for that organization at that point in time. So it's quite hard to really work out exactly what's going on, and definitely hard to predict the future in the parity landscape.
Quite literally, there could be someone in an office somewhere who's told, our quarter numbers aren't very good. We need to ramp up the bookings that are coming through Google. Please, can we, just be a little bit meaner on parity for the next few months and hope hotels don't notice?
Yeah, exactly. And then you add in COVID lockdowns happening at different times around the world, and you get quite a unpredictable landscape. Yeah.
I always think it is quite extraordinary, just that stopping and thinking the other side of this, what is going on? We were talking to investors about 5-6 years ago, raising money for Triptease, and I spoke to a guy who was then at a big fund that invests lots in travel companies. I think they're just about to float one this week, actually. And I was saying, he was asking about Triptease and what we do, and I was saying, yeah, we find this amazing stuff out about Parity, and we see Expedia do all these funny things where they know that the German hoteliers are asleep, and so at 2 in Berlin time, they start undercutting them for tourists in the USA, and then they change that back in the morning. And his face lit up, and he was like, that was me, my team. I built the team that did those things. And he was very proud of it. And I was like, yeah, maybe we're not going to take money from you. But yeah, clearly that's it. There are teams of people who are working out how they can use their sharp elbows to get away with things.
Right, exactly. So key takeaway here, though, is in the past sort of month or so in EMEA, we've got about 20% undercut rate on average across all European hotels that we work with. And I've worked it out for all the Triptease customers that we have in the room. This is a moment of truth for some of you, I guess. But about 62% of the room have better than average parity, which is great. Obviously, there's a little bit of room for improvement there, right? We want to see that percentage going higher and higher, especially for those of you attending DBS. Hopefully there's some takeaways you can, learnings and takeaways you can take with you and try and improve this. So having worked out how often are you being undercut, what's the next question that you want to ask? Probably, in my mind, it's who is responsible? So I've done that, obviously. We can check against all of the undercuts that we've seen in the past 30 days for hotels in Europe, who is responsible for those. And that's in this chart here. So you can see that Hotels.com, Booking, and Expedia are responsible for about 3/4 of all the undercuts that we've seen.
And just to be clear, what we're doing, so a guest arrives on a hotel website, they run a rate search, we go off and check on these websites. So on Hotels.com, what is the rate for that itinerary right now?
Yeah.
And that's what we see. Okay.
So this is a reflection of the searches that guests are making as well. Yeah. So yeah, this probably makes a lot of sense to a lot of you. These are often the key players that are involved in undercutting you. But I wasn't entirely satisfied with the question that I asked of the data, so I asked a different one. And I was curious, how often are we actually measuring prices on these OTAs? Like, how often do we actually go and see a price on these OTAs? And that's this chart here, which if you squint, you probably wouldn't have even noticed a difference. Like there's a slight shrinkage there in the terms of where hotels, Booking, and Expedia are, but it's pretty similar.
Oh, okay, so wait. So because what is happening is we, Triptease, get asked by hotels, please check these OTAs when my price is checked on my website. You're saying that we then go and check the OTAs we're told to check, and guess what? The ones we check the most are Booking, Hotels, and Expedia. Mm-hmm. And so when we look at who is undercutting people the most, guess what? It's the ones we check the most, or at least it might be. It might be that because we're checking Booking, Hotels, and Expedia the most, that's why we're most likely to see undercuts there.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Does that make sense? Okay, good. Yeah. It's early. It's all right. Please feel free to stop us at any time and say, wait a second, say that again. So actually, in a sense, the data is a little bit biased, potentially.
Yeah.
Because we're checking the OTAs that hotels have told us to check.
Exactly.
And that's important because there's a good reason why they were picked, but still it puts bias in the data.
Exactly. And we can correct for this, but it's perhaps not a super useful insight to be looking at this sort of thing when you average over all hotels. Of course, if you're just looking at the data for one hotel, this effect goes away because we measure all the OTAs each hotel is configured the same number of times. It's just when you aggregate over all the hotels we have in Europe, we just start to see this pattern of which hotels have been chosen to be compared to. So essentially, this insight is perhaps not that useful for you guys. So I wanted to ask a different question and try and draw out an insight that was going to be really interesting and useful. And I thought back to all the conversations I've had with hotels, with hoteliers over the past 6 months to a year. And there's always one theme that comes out in every conversation, and that is, what about parity in meta search? Right, this is the battleground that we've been talking about a lot over the past couple of days. We had the meta search parity reports yesterday morning. It's a different landscape because all the prices are next to each other. Right, and we have seen from our own meta search performance data that having the cheapest price in meta is extremely important, to the tune of 2.5x increase in click-through rate when you have the cheapest price in meta.
Yeah, and this is why we obsess about parity in meta, because for every dollar you spend in meta, you'll get $3 more, or 3 times as much actually by the end when it comes to final booking. So about 2.5 on the click-through, over 3 times overall. If you are the cheapest price in meta, you will get 3 times the number of bookings than you would have got if you weren't the cheapest price, if you were undercut. So it's really big impact. Because not only is it you get more bookings, but also it helps reduce the amount you have to spend in meta to attract people and to get bookings. And if you're doing really well, then it means that the OTAs that are bidding against you are doing less well, which means they're less likely to spend money against you, which means you don't have to spend as much money in the auction. Like, there are so many benefits. So that's why we obsess about this stuff, because it's not just when someone's on your website, they're more likely to book if you're in parity or better. It's also getting them to your website efficiently, effectively, cost-effectively improves.
Exactly, and it's really important then to make sure you focus on who is sort of winning meta in terms of price. Right? It's all very well and good to beat hotels.com, but if booking.com still beats you, it's kind of, you lose out on this effect of having more great click-through rates, right? So you can be cheaper than 9 out of 10 OTAs, but if one of them's better than you, you lose essentially in meta. So I wanted to ask a question in that kind of lens and focus on who has the best price and count on all the times we've seen all the prices on meta search, who had the best price out of the OTAs. And so that's what I'm going to show you next. And this is quite a substantially different chart to what I showed you before. So rather than hotels, Expedia, and Booking, being roughly equal size, taking up 3/4, it's now Booking.com overwhelmingly seems to have the best price in Europe on meta search out of the major OTAs. They've got 2/3 of the time they seem to have the best price. And Expedia are kind of almost not even in this chart, right? They're tiny, which is really interesting and surprising.
Yeah, it really surprised me because I thought that Expedia, maybe partly because I'm based in the US, but it always felt like Expedia was a more aggressive undercutter than Booking was. So this did tell me quite a different story than I expected. So does everyone get it? So this is, if you just look at meta search results, who's winning most of the time?
Who has the cheapest price, yeah.
Any thoughts or expectations? Did you all know this and just we didn't? No comments? Okay, well, carry on.
But the eagle-eyed among you will notice that here that this is just focusing on the major OTAs. And of course, in meta search, as you saw in your reports yesterday morning, it's populated with all of these new, exciting rogue OTAs that you may not have even heard of, right? Blue Pillow, or Zen Hotels, and these other ones.
Okay, so this is still when hotels are telling us which OTAs they care about on meta search.
Yeah, okay. So this is still of the ones that we are being told to look at, but we also obviously get all the prices for all the other ones.
Yep.
So I can throw all of those into the mix and see who is winning in terms of price on meta out of all the OTAs that we track. And this next one is a little bit, I need to sort of give a bit of a trigger warning because there's quite a lot of colors. Some of you may be feeling a little bit sore after last night, so I apologize also to the marketing team for not being able to use the brand, but there's too many OTAs here to keep to the brand colors. Okay. Here we go. Okay, so there's loads and loads and loads and loads of OTAs in here, and too many, you can't list them all. But the really interesting thing here is that Booking.com, formerly having 2/3 of the time having the best price in meta compared to the major OTAs, is diminished down to about 11%. It's still the second largest in terms of the number of times they're undercutting direct, but much smaller. And the interesting one here is that Trip.com comes out as being the key undercutter, as well as these other smaller ones, Find Hotel, Snap Travel, Destinia, and many, many more.
And so one could argue, I know we often get told, go pick these OTAs, please, focus on them because they're the ones that we think our guests take seriously. Like I'm sure that if Booking and Zen Hotels have exactly the same price, Booking's still going to attract many more consumers to book there because people trust the brand in a different way. So some of these are not irrelevant, but of less importance. But actually Trip.com, I think, is now a brand that people are beginning to trust. They hear more. It being a short URL, people trust it a bit more. I think some people probably confuse it with TripAdvisor too. And so that is an important one. And it's just, it's an amazingly different picture when you go, rather than where we started off. If you think about comparing this to that first pie chart where we were like, oh, it's hotels, Agoda and Booking.com are 2/3 of the undercuts, or 75% of the undercuts. Now it's like, actually, no, the biggest, the OTA that is winning the most on Meta is Trip.com. Right, big
Exactly,
change.
yeah. And I've got a question for the audience. How many of you here actually partner with Trip.com?
Oh, yeah. We're not saying you shouldn't. Don't have to be embarrassed.
A small number, right? So for the majority of the hoteliers in the room, you don't have an active agreement with Trip.com for them to sell your rooms. So they're getting your inventory somehow, clearly, and they're undercutting you as well.
And are there any others that you don't see on here that right now are a particular nuisance for you in Parity? Any other names? Zen Hotels. Yeah. We hear that a lot in Europe.
Yeah.
There's a question, a comment.
So, good morning. My name is Daniel, H Hotels.
Hi, Daniel.
With regards to Trip.com, we partner with Ctrip.
Right.
And these guys are feeding Trip.com. And, well, we have clear regulations with them and all written in the contract, so they don't undercut us. But this is where the rates are coming from.
Yes, it's the same because Ctrip bought Trip.com, which was previously a social sharing travel site, I think like 6-7 years ago, and then they rebranded the business in Europe anyway to Trip.
Yeah, so perhaps some of you are partnering with Ctrip then.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So that's where
same organization, different brand.
Yeah. Okay. How many of you track your Parity against Trip.com or Ctrip? A few of you. How many of you now want to start tracking your Parity against Ctrip? Okay, more of you. Okay, good. Okay, so we've worked out now we have a better understanding of who might be undercutting you on Meta. But there's obviously more questions we can ask. If you want to build up a bigger picture of what's going on, you need to ask more and more questions. So that's what we're going to do next. And of course, not all of these undercuts will be as impactful as others. Someone undercutting you by €1, it's not the same as someone undercutting you by 50 euros. So we can analyze all of the undercuts that we've seen for each of these OTAs, and we can work out the size of those undercuts, and we can plot a distribution to work out what's going on, basically. So that's what we're going to do now. More charts. Okay, so here we go. For the chart nerds in the room, this is a histogram. Fellow chart lovers, I should say. So we've got on the x-axis here, it's the relative size of an undercut, so in percentage terms. On the left, it's a 1% undercut relative to the direct price, and it increases from there. And then the size of the bars is basically the number of times we've seen that size of undercut on this OTA, which is Booking.com. So you can see there's much more undercuts of sort of between 1 and 10% than there are that are larger than that. But there's obviously this long tail of smaller, very large undercuts where we've got sort of 20 to 40% undercut size, which is quite worrying, and it's a question about where those rates are coming from. But there's also some interesting features in this chart as well. So like I show you these, there's some spikes in the data here, 5%, sort of 10% as well. I think there's one, 15%, 20%. These look like quite deliberate undercuts on the part of Booking.com, but I'm not exactly sure where these are coming from. So I don't know if anyone in the room, this resonates with anyone in the room. Do you often see Booking undercutting you by 5, 10, 15, 20%, something like that?
Yeah, specific amount. So we're definitely, those at 1%, our hypothesis would be many of the undercuts that are between 0 and 1% are often to do with exchange rates, for example, so very small amounts, and and there for whatever reason. But 5%, it feels like Booking is saying, we're going to have a standard undercut rate of 5% and frequently use it. And then these other ones, further 15. I think the really big ones is often where, in fact, there's a room discrepancy, right? And they've got a room, or they're still selling at a base room that maybe now the hotel knows is sold out. I think that's where some of the bigger ones come. And also it's worth bearing in mind, right, some of the searches here are for 1 night. Many of the searches will be for 5 nights or other combinations, and that's another reason why you get some of the bigger ones. But I guess, we want to pull out that not all undercuts are the same. And as we'll talk about in a bit, it's probably because the rate is coming from a different place, that they're undercutting in a different way at a different amount. And also because maybe the type of itinerary that the guest is searching for.
Yeah, and that point around where the rate is coming from, I think is really interesting in the next chart, where we compare this distribution for Booking.com to the one that we see for Agoda. So for Agoda, which is in orange, the bars on the sort of left-hand side of the chart where the undercuts are smaller, they're Agoda are undercutting less in that kind of range, but they seem to undercut more as soon as you start going above 10%. Which to me makes me think, are they, more keen to sell on like leaked wholesale inventory and that sort of thing? Like I've seen them do this from my own research, but it does seem to show in the data that they are undercutting by these larger amounts compared to Booking.com.
Yeah, because if Booking.com is charging a commission of 15%, their ability to undercut at 18% is like on their own direct inventory is obviously something they can't do. Whereas if you're getting a wholesale rate and you've got a bigger discount, you could do that. So yeah, it's a different, the volume of undercuts, Booking might be slightly more than Agoda, but the manner of undercutting that Agoda uses is different.
Yeah, but it's interesting because obviously these two organizations are affiliated.
Yeah.
And it's almost like Agoda are kind of doing Booking's dirty work in a way here by selling on the inventory. I mean, perhaps I shouldn't say that.
And another difference is that we probably see Agoda pricing more, for example, in APAC, as a percentage of APAC searches than we would in the US, where we might see more Booking, or in Europe. So there's also a slight hidden geo issue in here as well.
Yes, exactly. That's very true. Obviously, from the previous analysis, we saw that Trip.com were the biggest undercutters on meta search, so we should also look into what they're doing. And they seem to just have better prices at all points in this distribution. They seem to have more undercuts with smaller amounts, but also more undercuts with a larger size. Again, there's some big spikes around 15%, 20%.
Yeah.
Again, I'm sort of thinking these probably must be related to wholesale inventory in some way, because 15% is a very large amount to be undercutting. Yeah.
And again, when I see these, one of the things that goes through my mind when you see Trip is having to always be a little bit undercutting Booking.com by a bit more, or be a little bit more aggressive than Booking. I'm kind of like, that just doesn't surprise me, right? Somewhere there's a team of people at Trip.com who are having to say, we need to do better in Meta. We don't have the brand that Booking does. We're not able to convert people as well as Booking would, for example, in Europe. So they might just have to be a bit more aggressive to win what they see as their fair share. Fair maybe is a bit of the incorrect word, but
yeah.
Given that this is all at your expense.
Yeah, and I guess if they're kind of underdogs in this landscape as well, they need to do more to be noticed, right? And then I thought it would be also worth looking at one of the kind of smaller rogue OTAs that probably nobody in this room partners with. I'm not entirely sure. Correct me if I'm wrong. But looking at Find Hotel, which was another big one on that previous analysis, they have quite a different distribution actually in terms of the size of the undercuts. They've got this big spike around sort of 5%, and then another big spike in the 15 to 20% range. And again, I think that's the different kind of undercut, different types of rates. In the 5% range, it's probably more like they're playing with margin in order to undercut. But in the 15 to 20% range, it feels like, maybe they're selling on wholesale inventory that they've managed to get a hold of, which is quite interesting. We've talked about wholesale inventory quite a lot so far in this analysis. So I wonder if it might be a good opportunity to go to the room and discuss, does anyone have anything they would like to share about how you tackle leaked wholesale rates?
Yeah.
It's quite an interesting topic.
Anyone share? Are you actively doing something to try and prevent wholesalers from reselling and then undercutting you? Are you identifying occasionally times you're like, ooh, that's a wholesale price pushed on? Yes, thank you. Oh, yeah.
We are not contracting them at all.
That's a great way of doing it. That certainly prevents that's really, well, actually now, immediately, there's 8 hotels, right? I'm instantly thinking, I want to see your parity report. I wonder if your undercuts tend to be in the like 5-6% range and you don't have many at the bigger range. But yeah, turning off wholesalers. And that's also gutsy. Was that a difficult decision to take internally? Because I know a lot of hotels are scared of doing that. Oh, Sam, you might have to go back.
Yeah, we took the decision 5 years ago, and of course everyone was scared because the allocations were not on the books. And well, but we got through it, and it was in the end, it was just the best decision you could make because you're getting the bookings anyway.
Yeah.
It's just a different channel.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And there was another one, I think, down here, Sam. Hi. Good morning.
And
Okay, great. Oh, yes, sorry, let's go over here first. Hello.
Hi, good morning. So, well, we are working with a wholesale and we have very great contracts at place, and despite all the other agreements, we are still checking on them, and occasionally, of course, something pops out. But from my perspective, I believe that it's the part of cooperation as well, and with the partnership that you have, and if they are honoring you and you are honoring them, then this is great cooperation anyway. So
Yeah, and so I just want to dig a little deeper into that, right? Because I find that, and just to be clear, wholesalers can fulfill a fabulous partnership role. Some hotels will talk about, well, look, we have really great relationships with our wholesale partners, and I really have like such a great personal relationship. Yeah, they undercut us, and they have a negative impact, but they can still feel they've got a great relationship. And there are other hoteliers who will just maybe describe on the surface level, we have a very good relationship, but somehow that relationship feels more balanced towards the hotelier having some like power or being. Is there anything? So I just want to dig into when obviously you say you have a good relationship and it works well, and it sounds like they're not a major issue for you when it comes to parity. Is there anything you're doing, or is there a person at the hotel group who's managing that like in a specific way? Because I don't want to lead too much the witness, but I have a bit of a view of what we see from other hotels, so I'm just wondering if you could describe how that relationship's managed.
well, of course, our revenue managers are responsible for day-to-day parity check, and as I said, we have a great account manager on the other side. So if we see even one case that something goes sideways, or if we just think that something maybe could go sideways, we have immediate response from them, and they're generally saying, yeah, hey, in this case, we really noticed that some of our partners gave your direct rate. Sorry for that. Nothing like that again will happen again. So this is daily work from our side and daily work from their side as well. So
great, thank you. So I'm just going
to
just because I feel it's something that's come up before in other DBSs is it's very easy, and we often say here hoteliers and sometimes it's sort of marketing struggling with distribution person who's like gone and signed loads of contracts and will say we have a great relationship with them, and marketing will be like but they're abusing us when it comes to parity. The relationships that feel like the most productive are ones where it's not just based on blind trust. We have a great relationship. I love this person. We get on really well. We have a great relationship, but I just will constantly be checking and hassling them if they're not continuing to like uphold the rules we've got with them. So we do find that it's the revenue teams that are like really aggressive, for want of a better word, at just making sure that they're not going to be taken for a ride. There was one. Oh yes, here. Sorry.
Hi, Maru. Yeah, of course we are being undercut, but we have managed that a lot, and like I agree with her. We do work with wholesalers, but not many, and try to keep a good partnership, and I don't find them as much as Booking.com undercutting us.
Cool.
I feel like now, lately, is Booking.com undercutting through their Genius and mobile rates.
Right.
And that is what I'm seeing more than the wholesalers undercutting.
Genius rates, that's because often you're funding their loyalty program, which is very generous of you.
Yeah, very generous. Very generous.
Not something you have to do
No,
necessarily.
no, no, no. So yeah,
cool.
and just yeah, what we're doing is just rate shopping and
Yeah.
test bookings and confronting whenever we see something.
Great.
But they're being very sneaky.
Sneaky. Okay, well, thank you very much. I think there's a quick couple more there. Oh.
Do you have static rates or both on third parties, wholesalers? Both.
Okay.
We've got time for one more question.
Yeah,
then.
one more.
Yeah,
One more.
one more.
So I'm joining in on H hotels in the success of not having wholesalers. We dropped them 5 years ago as well. After a very big analysis of their business, how it impacted our ADR compared to lead time, as well as in a 2-year period, and what it did to our business. We did that with our revenue management system, and we took the clients directly and measured per client how they impacted our ADR and in which period we had unconstrained demand to actually fill our house ourselves. From the day we dropped them, we increased our ADR with 12%. We increased our NPS score from in the mid-50s to the mid-60s. We jumped 5 places in 5 months on TripAdvisor because the clients booking us actually chose us and wasn't we weren't put down their throat in a package somewhere. So
wow, there's lots
that
of
was a
secondary
big
benefits.
success,
Yeah.
to be honest. But yeah, everybody was scared when we did it.
Well, thank you very much for sharing. It's a bit like Alcoholics Anonymous, isn't it? So, anyway, thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much. Okay, so that's a really interesting discussion, and I'm probably going to go and talk to those of you who've been speaking in particular later today to try and understand a little bit more about what you've been doing. But back to some data analysis. We've got time for just 3 more charts, so you've just got to bear with me while we go into these, because there's always more questions to ask of the data. If you don't feel like you know exactly what's going on, ask more questions of the data. If you do think you know what you understand what's going on, ask more questions of the data, because there's always more to learn. So I'm going to go a little bit deeper now and break down the kind of undercut rate that we see for each of those OTAs we've just looked at by a number of different factors. So one of them is looking at different countries in Europe. This is based on where the hotel is located. What's the undercut rate for these OTAs in each of these countries? And this one's quite interesting, right? Because, yes, in general, you see Find Hotel and Trip, the black and the orange bars, having larger undercut rates overall, which is what we saw in the previous analyses, which is consistent, so that's good. But it's not uniform, right, between all the countries. So if you look at a country like Germany, where you'll see actually that the undercut rates for all of those OTAs are roughly in line, and actually Agoda's slightly lower. So, you know, our hypothesis that perhaps Trip and Find Hotel were doing more with wholesale rates than the others, perhaps that's not quite so prevalent in Germany.
Well, particularly if I look at like Portugal and Spain, compare that to, say, Germany, so they're kind of towards the middle. It looks like in Portugal and Spain, Find Hotel and Trip are significantly undercutting more than, say, Booking.com. And I assume that's because for those 2 markets, they are taking wholesale rates, whereas in Germany, that doesn't seem to be the case. Yeah. I don't know if anything jumps out at people. And this is, to be clear, this is the country of the hotel.
Of the hotel, yeah.
Not of the searcher.
Yeah. Another thing that interested me here was if you look at Ireland and Great Britain, Trip.com seems to be much more aggressively undercutting than the other OTAs, and I wonder if that's like a kind of commercial decision from Trip.com to try and penetrate these markets.
Yep.
I don't know exactly, that's a hypothesis. If we want to find it out, I'd have to go and ask more questions of the data, but we don't have all day, so I can't do that. Anyway, I'll move on to the next one. Another way to break this down, of course, is by lead time. Now, this one didn't have quite as obvious a trend as I thought it might, but there does seem to be generally more undercutting at very short lead time across all these OTAs. And of course, Find Hotel and Trip, again, are undercutting more aggressively at pretty much all lead times.
Yes.
Which is interesting, right? Because our hypothesis is that these 2 OTAs are more frequently selling on leaked wholesale rates.
Yes.
Right?
And this is like this is a key takeaway coming up here now, which is that doesn't solve all parity issues, but allows you to address a specific type of parity issue. So we hit the next slide.
Yeah.
Which is, so if you work on the hypothesis that Find Hotel and Trip are selling wholesale rates, and certainly when we speak to hoteliers about why have you signed up a wholesaler, it's often, I'm going to tap a market I wouldn't otherwise reach, and generally they're going to, because that is the case, that means they're generally also longer lead time bookings. And that's what I want from my wholesaler, a new market and longer lead time bookings. Because ultimately, if you're getting people booking 1, 2, 3 days before coming to your hotel, I don't know, 80, 90% of those people are likely to be booking online, and it's not like they're in a brochure or anything else. They're probably starting at Google. And if they didn't find your wholesaler rate, they'd probably just find your direct rate or your booking.com or Expedia rate. So if you've got wholesalers who are getting you bookings on a short lead time, then it should be a bit of a red flag. Another reason why it's a bit of a red flag is if you think about, particularly if you've got any static rates out there, if you have a static rate, the incentive for the wholesaler to cheat increases the more that there's a gap between the static rate and the price. That gap generally is biggest when you've got short lead time, right? When you know you're sold out and your rates are really high for a date, the gap can be the largest. So that's when the wholesalers are most inclined to say, oh my God, I can't help myself. I've got this rate that's so low, I've got to go and try and sell it on. So one of the analyses, was interesting to hear that one over there earlier, that I recommend doing is if you go in your PMS, you just I want to look at 2 years of bookings that came from by wholesaler. I want to look at this wholesaler and look at all the bookings they got me. If they're averaging 40-day lead time, well, that's great. That's like the wholesaler doing as you expected. But you'll find some wholesalers, if you've got 10, you might find 3 of them are actually getting most of the bookings for you with a 2-day, 3-day lead time. And those are the ones where I'd say you're probably not getting much additional incremental value from those wholesalers. And so one of the strategies we've seen hotels use that's very effective, if you're scared of saying, we want to cut this distribution channel altogether, is recognize wholesalers on short lead time are probably not adding much value, so I'm going to block them out 5 days before, 5-day lead times. I won't let the wholesaler have the rate. Or 7-day lead time or 14-day. But I'm going to take a certain amount of time where I don't think I need the wholesaler, and so I'm just going to not give them access to my rates for that period of time. And that would immediately get rid of, you can see here, all of these undercuts that are wholesale reselling. Does that make sense? So thinking about not necessarily blank cutting wholesale, but thinking about where are they adding value for me and where do I think they're not. And our general hypothesis is if people are booking with a short lead time, they're probably far more likely to be starting on Google, at which point they don't need your wholesale rate. They can just be finding your booking or your hopefully even better direct rate.
Yeah, really, really interesting insight, and I think we're definitely one of the key takeaways. One more chart, final chart, guys. Then your brains can relax and you can go about the rest of your day. I wanted to break this down by lead time as well. By length of stay. Because my hypothesis with length of stay is that your undercut rate should increase as you look for longer stays, because if an OTA has access to cheaper inventory for a particular night, the chances of that night being involved in a particular itinerary increases as you increase the length of the search that you've made.
Yeah, so if you've got a 2-day stay and you're normally $100 and there's an undercut on the second day, it's included. If you've got a 1-day stay, it's a 50-50 whether the undercut was there.
Right, exactly.
So the longer the stay, the more chance you should be undercut. So we expect higher undercut with longer length of stay.
Which was my hypothesis. And we kind of see that trend for Find Hotel and Trip, but we don't really see much of a trend in Agoda and Booking. And I'm not exactly sure why that would be. I've drawn some lines on here. Kind of looks like those orange bars are going up to the right. Maybe Booking's going down, but it doesn't really make an awful lot of sense to me, that one. So at this point, I would need to go and ask more questions of this data to try and work out exactly what's going on. But we are now at the end of the session, so we can't do that one. But if any of you are particularly interested in this, we can chat about it at the break or at lunchtime or anything like that. Just come and find me. I love talking about charts, so just come and find me. I've got loads on my laptop. We can spend all afternoon looking at charts, trust me.
I guess one of the other factors would be we saw how all OTAs often have a 0 to 1% undercut, and that often is because of just currency issues. The more number of days in your stay, if there was a currency like issue, discrepancy, that gets flattened out as you take more days. So that could be part of this. It doesn't feel like that's quite big enough to have this, but that would be one of the effects working the other direction.
Yes, true.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. So to summarize then, key points. Out of the major OTAs, Booking.com seem to be the chief undercutters in Europe. But when you look on Meta and you take into account all of the OTAs that are available there, Trip.com really come through as the chief undercutter. We're suspecting that rogue OTAs with access to wholesale rates will also going to be starting to dominate on meta search. And I think the really interesting thing from what Charlie pointed out with regards to wholesalers, if you don't necessarily need them to be selling your rates at short lead time, because those guests searching for short lead times are on the internet already. And finally, my key takeaway is ask loads of questions of the data that you have. Keep asking questions until you can't think of any more, and hopefully you will start to understand what's going on in a little bit more detail. Thanks very much for your time. Any questions? We don't have time for questions.
Great, yeah. Yep, there's one there, and Jimmy in front.
Thanks, Jimmy. So, Dan Bodott, Triptease. For those really rogue OTAs that basically are doing kind of like clickbait, where you go through and then they go, oh, please give us your email address, and then we'll get back to you. Any suggestions there? Because that just seems like completely unstoppable. I mean, what do you do with that?
I think again, it's if you happen to have really, let's call it robust relationships with your wholesalers, and on occasion you book and do a test booking through that, and you identify where it's come from, then that's the key, is having robust. The only way to completely get rid of it is not to have any third-party distribution partners at all. That's the only way for sure, but obviously that's not something that's open to all hotels. So I think it's just running test bookings, again, be the consumer, book it with the name Mickey Mouse and see where that comes from on the PMS, or when the booking comes into the PMS. And you've just got to do that occasionally, and then hold them to account. I mean, some people do a 3 strikes and out policy with wholesalers. They're like, if we catch you 3 times in a row, then we're going to turn you off for a month. That's another way of showing them that you're serious about it. And that's it. Well, thank you very much. And as I say, so Andrew will be around, the direct booking coaches as well. Happy to look at your Parity and come up with any other ideas, suggestions, comparisons, benchmarks that we can. Thank you very much.
Right, thanks very much.